Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Craig and to Toscon for giving me this opportunity to speak about something that means a lot to me and a topic that's very important. 50,000 years ago, our ancestors lived at the mercy of nature. They had no agriculture. Their food came from hunting and foraging. At night, a campfire would have been their only source of light and warmth. They had language, but no writing. Any knowledge, skills they wanted to pass on to the generations had to be done through storytelling and oral tradition. Just a few hundred years ago, civilization had come a very long way, and yet most people still lived in what we today would consider extreme poverty. We now had agriculture, but it was back-breaking manual labor, and it was extremely unproductive to the point where roughly half the workforce had to be farmers just to feed the other half. Light now would have come from candles, but not from electric lighting, and not from sweet-smelling beeswax candles either. No, most people would have only been able to afford candles made from animal fat, tallow, things like that. And disease was rampant. Epidemics of plague, smallpox, cholera, influenza would sweep through and decimate populations. Today, of course, we have come a very long way. We travel in style and comfort and at high speeds. We live and work in towers of gleaming steel, glass, and concrete. Right? We connect with each other. We communicate instantly across the globe. We have recorded music and video for entertainment. We have access to the world's knowledge at our fingertips. And we are much healthier. By the numbers, per capita incomes in industrialized nations have increased some 20 to 30 times since before the beginning of the industrial age. And life expectancy around the world has more than doubled from an average life expectancy at birth of under 30 years in 1800 to over 70 years today. And yes, that is a world average. And yet, not everyone is happy about this world that we have created. So this headline ran in The Atlantic on an editorial some years ago. Is progress good for humanity? With progress in scare quotes, right? So-called progress. Jared Diamond, the historian, has called agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. Agriculture, a mistake. Economic growth is variously referred to as an addiction, a fetish, a Ponzi scheme, or, my favorite, a fairy tale. There is even now an entire degrowth movement. That's right, degrowth, advocating regress, not progress, as the ideal that we should aspire to, right, in the name of sustainability. What happened to the idea of progress? Well, the first thing to understand is that the idea of progress has not existed in most places and times in human history. In the ancient world, many people saw history as cyclical, just ups and downs. Or perhaps they even believed a declinist narrative in which the past was a golden age from which we have fallen, and perhaps will continue to fall. In medieval Europe in particular, you can imagine how looking back at the ruins of ancient Roman wonders, like the Colosseum and the aqueducts, it must have been easy to believe that those ancient people were the greatest humans who ever lived, a race of giants and geniuses, and that all knowledge that matters was revealed to them in ancient times. And that is, we the moderns can never equal their knowledge or achievements, that all we can do is revere them, learn from their ancient texts, and so forth. Well, the first cracks in that idea came in the West around the 1400s with the Age of Discovery. By the time we had encountered an entire new continent that was unknown to the ancients, it seemed that perhaps not all the knowledge had been revealed to them in ancient times. The ancients also did not know about the compass, about gunpowder, about the printing press. And by the late 1500s, early 1600s, some philosophers were starting to take note of this pattern and what it meant. And from a relatively few examples, they drew some large generalizations. Francis Bacon, in particular, pointed out that, with the compass and the gunpowder, well, maybe there was some special property of materials that we had to discover. But they're printing. There's nothing in the art of printing which is not plain and obvious. It's a mechanical invention. Now, you might feel dumb about this as the human race, like, why did it take us so long? But Francis Bacon looked at this and he took optimism from this. He said, look, if something like printing, this amazing invention that gives us so much labor productivity, if that was just lying around for the longest time and nobody found it until now, what else is out there? Quote, noble inventions may be lying at our very feet. And he encouraged his contemporaries and generations after him to study the world, to systematically observe nature, and to find useful knowledge that would improve the arts and sciences. Indeed, he said that the goal of science ultimately is that human life be endowed with new discoveries and powers. One of the greatest predictions ever made in history. And it took hundreds of years to fully come true. Now, if there was any doubt about the ancients versus the moderns, it was laid to rest with Newton and his system of the heavens, his explanation of the solar system and his theory of universal gravitation. This was so obviously beyond anything the ancients had left us, any theory from Ptolemy or anyone else, that it settled the debate once and for all. We, the moderns, can surpass the ancients. The following century, the 1700s, was the flowering of the Enlightenment, and especially the climax of optimism. And perhaps no one exemplified that optimism better than the French Enlightenment thinker, the Marquis de Condorcet. Towards the end of his life, towards the end of the 1700s, he wrote a book, a sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind, in which he forecast virtually unlimited progress in every dimension, not only in science and technology, but in morality and society. He foresaw the equality of the sexes, peace among nations. And he thought that prosperity would naturally dispose men to humanity, to benevolence, and to justice. That the moral goodness of man is susceptible of an indefinite improvement. And that nature has connected by a chain which cannot be broken, truth, happiness, and virtue. All these things that went together hand in hand. Now, it is all the more remarkable for his optimism that he wrote this while he was hiding out from the French Revolution, who was hunting him down in order to execute him because he dared criticize the Constitution of 1793. Truly, his optimism knew no bounds. Unfortunately, for Condorcet, he could not hide out forever. He was soon captured and died in jail. Evidently, the moral perfection of mankind was slow in coming. But technological progress was racing ahead. The following century saw an amazing set of inventions that transformed the world, such as the railroad, the telephone, the electric light bulb. Progress was the watchword of the day. Men like Thomas Edison were national heroes. Progress was no longer something for philosophers to theorize about. It was a reality coming into homes and factories, brought about by scientists and inventors and entrepreneurs. And some people were starting to realize that this class of people deserved more credit than they had traditionally gotten. Samuel Smiles, a great biographer of what at the time were called mechanics, we would call them engineers and inventors and so forth, of the 1800s, pointed out that kings, warriors, and statesmen have monopolized the pages of biography. Some niche ought to be found for the mechanic. There is a heroism of skill and toil belonging to that latter class, worthy of as grateful record, less perilous and romantic it may be than those of the kings and warriors, but not less full of the results of human energy, bravery, and character. When the Brooklyn Bridge was opened in 1883, the speeches that were given, the bridge was a wonder of science, an astounding exhibition of the power of man to change the face of nature, a monument to enterprise, skill, faith, endurance, a monument to the public spirit, to the moral qualities of the human soul, and a great everlasting symbol of peace. By the end of the century, it was clear that something truly amazing was going on. Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist, better known for his work on evolution with Darwin, wrote a book towards the end of the 1800s titled The Wonderful Century. In it, he counted up the great discoveries and inventions. He counted up 24 such discoveries and inventions attributed to the 1800s, versus only 15 for all of human history before then. Really an age of wonders. January 1st, 1901, the New York World published an editorial saying that we are optimistic enough to believe that the 20th century will meet and overcome all perils and prove to be the best this steadily improving planet has ever seen. Imagine reading that editorial in a newspaper today, by the way. And they hadn't seen anything yet. Soon, a man would fly. Evidently, the optimism of the Enlightenment had been justified after all. And if the prophecy of Francis Bacon, that scientific and technological progress could happen, well, if that could come true, perhaps the moral and social progress prophesied by Condorcet could come true as well. It seemed plausible at the time. Within recent history, we had seen monarchy toppled, the establishment of democratic republics, representative government. Slavery had been ended in the West. And new inventions like the telegraph were creating new ways for people to communicate and to connect. And it was thought that this would lead to greater understanding. This drawing was celebrating the completion of the transatlantic telegraph cable. Yes, they laid a cable across the ocean at the bottom of the sea in the 1800s. And so here's America and Britain in symbolic or allegorical form here, smiling at each other and shaking hands across the channel. Less than 100 years earlier, they'd been fighting a war. Indeed, at a dinner speech celebrating Samuel Morse, one of the telegraph inventors, it was said that different nations and races of men will know one another better, may be moved by common sympathies and swayed by common interests. The electric spark is the true Promethean fire, which is to kindle human hearts. Men will learn they are brethren, and it is not less their interest than their duty to cultivate goodwill and peace throughout the earth. Indeed, some of the most optimistic thinkers of this age hoped that the growth of industry and prosperity and the expansion of trade between nations would lead to an end to war, a new era of world peace. But they were wrong. The world wars of the 20th century violently shattered these naive illusions. Technology had not led to an end to war. It had made war all the more terrible and deadly. And as if to put a horrible exclamation point on this lesson, the atomic bomb was dropped in 1945, the most destructive weapon the world had ever seen. Clearly the product of modern science, modern technology, and modern industrial capacity. And it wasn't just the wars. The West had been through an economic crash and a depression. Totalitarianism was on the rise around the world. It was getting harder and harder to believe in the fundamental rationality of mankind, or in the predictability and controllability of nature. As early as the 1930s, historians such as Carl Becker were saying that the fact of progress is disputed and the doctrine discredited, and asking what, if anything, may be said on behalf of the human race. May we still, in whatever different fashion, believe in the progress of mankind. What had gone wrong? How had the world reached such a state, just when everything seemed to be going so well? Well, the idea of progress had never been without its detractors. Rousseau in the 1700s said that our souls have become corrupted to the extent that our sciences and our arts have advanced toward perfection. This was even before the Industrial Revolution really got going, but Rousseau thought that our moral character and human well-being were pretty much inversely correlated with so-called progress in arts and sciences, in our knowledge and our skills and abilities. Now, voices like Rousseau's had been around the whole time, but for a long time they were hard to hear over the cheering for all of the new inventions. After the wars, people started to reconsider and to rethink, and so they started to think a lot more about some of the challenges to the idea of progress. These challenges became a lot more salient to them. So let's talk about what some of them were. Automation had always been controversial. As early as the 1600s, textile workers were rioting, smashing and burning machinery, fighting the machines that were taking their jobs. Today it's robots who might take all our jobs, but back then it was spinning machines and so forth. Pollution had long been a problem. In the 1800s, sewer systems were dumping so much sewage into the Thames that this cartoon was created showing the Thames offering up its children, which are diseases like diphtheria and scrofula and cholera. And indeed, this problem with the sewage helped to exacerbate cholera outbreaks. Air pollution as well was a problem, especially when we started burning massive quantities of coal. Both London and Pittsburgh were referred to, or were likened to hell on earth from the black clouds of smoke. Andrew Carnegie, surely no enemy of industry, said that Pittsburgh at the time, I think this is about the 1860s, he said, "The smoke permeated and penetrated everything. If you placed your hand on the balustrade of the stair, it came away black. If you washed face and hands, they were as dirty as ever in an hour. The soot gathered in the hair and irritated the skin. And after we returned from the mountain atmosphere, life was more or less miserable for a time." That's how bad it got. And even as Carnegie and Morgan and Rockefeller were amassing fortunes from the new industry, many people were still living in poverty. Crowded tenement houses like this, several people to a room, no plumbing, no electricity, no toilets, quite dilapidated conditions. For a long time, mortality rates were higher in the city, noticeably higher in the city than in the country, because of the spread of disease. That was true until the 1900s. And at the same time, as resources like coal were causing these problems, some people were also worried that those resources would run out. From the 1800s, William Stanley Jevons wrote this pamphlet or book, The Coal Question, warning that Britain was running out of coal and that was the foundation of its dominance in the world. Now, these are some old problems that had been around long before the wars, but there were also around the late 19th century, early 20th century, some new problems that were coming into existence because of new technologies and because of the increasing industrialization of the economy. Food safety was one. It used to be that people got a lot of their food fresh from local farms. Now in the late 1800s, food is starting to get transported over long distances, be processed in meatpacking plants or other sorts of industrial processing. And some of these plants had really horrible sanitation. I mean, the descriptions of some of the meatpacking plants are quite disgusting, and they were spreading disease. Milk was transported warm in open containers on the railroads, right? A literal breeding ground for bacteria. And if you did get sick, the medicines that you bought to cure your disease might be completely worthless or even harmful to your health. There was a whole industry called the patent medicine industry, which was mostly full of shams and fraud around the turn of the last century. New technologies could also be dangerous. X-rays were first thought to be harmless, and then it was found that they caused burns and sickness and cancer. So, progress is messy. It is full of risks, setbacks. Progress creates new problems, which we then have to solve. But what do we make of these facts? Facts do not explain themselves. History does not interpret itself. It is up to historians and philosophers and other intellectuals to offer explanations, to make sense of the world and what happens. What were some of the explanations that were offered in the 20th century? Well, a number of them decided that progress itself was the problem, that the problem lay in the very project of modernity, hearkening back to Rousseau, perhaps, and other voices like his. Now, most obvious and one of the most prominent, of course, was the environmentalist movement. Authors like William Vogt, Paul Ehrlich, said that technology was disconnecting us from nature and from our communities, that it had hidden health risks which would become apparent over time, and that there were natural, inherent limits to growth which we ignore at our peril. These ideas found purchase and soon created a radical social movement based on a deep distrust of technology and industry. And again, it wasn't the only one, but it was, perhaps the most prominent. These ideas also quickly found their way into law and policy. In a court decision about a new nuclear plant that was to be opened, the decision written by the judge opened, or in the introduction, said that this case was the beginning of what promises to become a flood of new litigation to protect the environment. Several recently enacted statutes attest to the commitment of the government to control at long last the destructive engine of material progress. And again, this is quote-unquote progress, so-called progress. By the 1990s, it was amazing to some authors that anybody could still believe in progress at all. In the introduction to his book, The True and Only Heaven, Christopher Lasch writes, "How does it happen that serious people continue to believe in progress in the face of massive evidence that might have been expected to refute the idea of progress once and for all?" Well, in this political and cultural milieu, it is not at all surprising that progress has begun to show signs of slowing down. The growth rate in GDP per capita in the US is on a multi-decade slow decline. Now, granted, in some areas, progress has been racing ahead, especially in computers and the internet. Progress has not stopped by any means, and in certain fields, it really doesn't even seem to have slowed down. But many other fields are lagging behind: manufacturing, construction, energy, transportation. Nuclear power was stunted. The Concorde was grounded. The Apollo program was canceled. And the flying cars that we were promised never arrived. Today, we cannot even build enough housing to meet demand, and prices are on the rise. Where does this leave us? Well, the 19th century philosophy of progress was naive, perhaps hopelessly so. But the 20th century rejection of progress was a mistake. And the fatalism and defeatism that arose in that era and took hold of the popular consciousness are wrong, and they are not a way forward. We need a new philosophy of progress for the 21st century and beyond. One that reaffirms the reality and the value of progress itself. One that does so on the basis of humanism, that is, human well-being as the standard of value. And one that does so by reaffirming, in part, human agency to shape the future. Our fundamental ability to control, at least in significant part, our destiny. At the same time, we must avoid the mistakes of the past. What got us here in the first place. Progress is not inevitable, as many thought in the 18th and 19th centuries. It does not unfold inexorably according to a divine plan or a will of its own. Progress is up to us. Progress has risks and costs, which we must control. Everything from accidents that happen with our machines and our vehicles, to the health hazards of chemicals and radiation, to unknown future risks that may be created by new technologies. And this means that we have to embrace safety as a part of progress. Safety should be considered a first-class citizen. If the world is making progress, it also means, hopefully, that overall we are getting safer. In many ways, important ways, especially on a day-to-day basis, we have gotten much safer over the years. You can ask me for details if you want in the question period. We should make sure that continues to go forward. Another lesson, especially lesson of the 20th century, is that moral progress and technological progress do not go hand in hand. Not necessarily. They do not follow in lockstep together. morality can stagnate or even regress, even as technology is racing ahead. And that can be a very bad combination. The new philosophy of progress must also paint a vision of the future. What kind of future do we want to create? What kind of world do we want to live in? And in my view, it should be a bold, ambitious, technological future. One where we cure aging, create fusion energy and nanotech manufacturing, control the climate, terraform planets, and settle the solar system. To establish this new philosophy of progress requires a progress movement. Students should learn about the history of progress in schools. Adults should learn about it from journalism in magazines and newspapers and online. Right? Everyone should absorb it from popular culture, from art and entertainment. Think about biopics of great scientists and inventors, right? Or optimistic science fiction that paints for us that vision of what the future could be like. But the foundation of all of this and of any intellectual movement is books. There are dozens and dozens of books that need to be written about progress. Several of them have been written already, but we need lots more. Here are a few of my favorite ones about progress from recent years. I myself am working on a book. Working title is The Story of Industrial Civilization, Towards a New Philosophy of Progress for the 21st Century. It's going to be about 3/4 history and 1/4 philosophy. The history parts will tell the story of the discoveries and inventions that created the modern world and gave us the standard of living that we now enjoy. And then the philosophy part will answer some basic questions about the meaning of all of this progress. Like, is progress good? Can progress continue? And what should we do about it? 5 years ago, I started a blog. It was a side project at the time called The Roots of Progress. A few years ago, I made it my full-time focus. And last year, I created it as a nonprofit organization to support my work. And I'll say a little bit more at the very end about what our plans are. But it's not just me. I'm not alone. In the last couple of years, there has arisen an entire progress movement. And it really got kicked off with this article in The Atlantic. But written by an economist at George Mason, Tyler Cowen, head of the Mercatus Center there, and a technology founder from Silicon Valley, Patrick Collison, CEO of Stripe. And it ran under this headline, "We need a new science of progress." In this article, they coined the term progress studies and said that we needed more focus and study on progress, that it's underappreciated, and we really should be trying to get more of it. The Atlantic actually has recently launched an entire progress initiative dedicated to exploring this concept. Maybe they're making up for that article that ran a few years ago, the editorial about it. No. I love The Atlantic, by the way. It's probably my favorite magazine. There is a new quarterly journal dedicated to progress, an online magazine called Works in Progress. I've written there. There is now a DC policy think tank called the Institute for Progress, which is pursuing policy changes to try to promote technological and industrial progress. There is a media network called the Progress Network that amplifies all of these voices. So, I invite you to join us. If you are a scientist or an engineer or an entrepreneur, a founder, you are already helping to move progress forward. So keep doing what you're doing, and please be ambitious in your career. If you are a historian, a philosopher, an economist, you should be studying progress. If it hasn't already been a major focus of your work, it should be something you pay attention to, and there's a lot of, and integrate into your work. If you are someone whose job is to communicate, an educator or a journalist, perhaps, progress should become a part of what you communicate to the world. If you are a writer or an artist, inspire. Show people what they can create and how life can be better. If you are a parent, make sure your children get educated about progress. They probably won't get it in school. This might be something where you have to supplement. It tends to fall through the cracks of history and science classes, but it's a really important part of an education and of understanding the world. And whoever you are, in whatever capacity, study, learn the history of progress. Get involved with my organization, some of the organizations that I've mentioned, and just become a part of this movement. Together, we will reach for the stars. Thank you. Okay, so as everybody's lining up for questions, I'm gonna, in the interlude, I wanna make a little announcement about what's going on with my organization. This is a pre-announcement because it hasn't been formally publicly announced yet, but it will be in the next couple of weeks. So I mentioned that I created a nonprofit organization to fund my work. Until now, it's been pretty much just me. It's been like a one-man research institute, or it's been the Jason Crawford show, which is great, but it is time for us to expand. There is enough energy and support for this movement and for our work in particular that we are going to expand into supporting other public intellectuals in progress studies. And to do this, and we're also going to be doing community building and a lot of other things. We've launched an online forum for discussion about progress called the Progress Forum. And we're going to be doing more meetups and events, workshops, conferences, and so forth. To run all of this is going to require a staff and a real budget, and it's going to require someone to do the fundraising and the team building. And so within the next couple of weeks, we're going to be announcing that we are launching a search for a CEO. I want to focus as much as possible on my research and writing, and so I will sort of remain the president of the organization, but we're going to be looking for someone to come on as pretty much an equal partner to me to do the management and leadership. So, if you're interested in the job or you know someone who might be great for the job, actually, even if they're totally ungettable right now, but they would just be great for this somehow, I would love to get connected and introduced. And please stay tuned for the formal announcement that will come probably in the next 2 weeks or so. All right, let's go. I'll get through as many of these as I can.
Hi, I know the progress movement seems to be rather new, but I was wondering, have you personally, or the progress movement in general, anyone you know, have received any pushback or any kind of resistance to the progress movement? And if so, anything salient that comes to mind?
Oh yeah, sure, of course. From the mainstream sort of, if you just picked a random person and told them about the progress movement, the two biggest things I would say you tend to get are climate change and inequality, right? Progress creates both of these things. These are bad. Progress is not great. There's a lot of concern about sustainability, right? The idea that, there's a general idea that we can't push economic growth very much more without destroying the planet, using up all our resources, you name it. There's also a real distinct lack of imagination of how much better life could be. At best, people can imagine that all the poor countries in the world would come up to the current standard of the wealthiest ones. But almost nobody has the view that, look, if we are fantastically rich compared to the world of 200 years ago, well, the world of 200 years in the future, or maybe even less, could be fantastically rich compared to today. And in a certain sense, we should consider our current standard of living as almost like extreme poverty compared to the future, right? So that imagination is not there. The most intelligent and thoughtful criticisms of progress that I hear are around the risk and safety question. To just throw one out that I think you can appreciate without a much deep explanation. Biotechnology could create new pandemics, either by accident or perhaps on purpose, as weapons. And the more we make it easy to engineer proteins and print DNA with a $1,000 machine that you can run in your basement or something, right? The more we enable, maybe some terrorist sect or whatever to do these things. And so I do think that people who are on the forefront of technology, especially in areas like biotech and AI and so forth, have to think very carefully about what you are creating. Again, I think that's some of the lessons of the 20th century. So, yeah, thanks.
So, is this working? So,
getting close, yeah.
Much of the talk was about technological progress. However, you did touch upon the fact that it must come hand in hand with moral progress, and moral progress can regress. So I was wondering, one of the biggest fears that people have with technological progress is that people might misuse it for various different reasons. And my question is, how do we ensure that that moral progress keeps up?
Yeah. It's not easy. Moral progress seems to be less consistent, right, and more difficult than technological progress, which seems somehow much easier. How do we make sure it keeps up? I mean, we go back to the fundamentals, right? Reason, revisiting the basic ideas of the Enlightenment, and I think part of it actually, so part of the reason why I focus a lot on technological progress, even though there's all this concern about moral progress, is that I think the technological progress that we've made and how much it actually has made human life better are a large part of the vindication and validation of the ideas of the Enlightenment. And I think, so ultimately, I think if we, recognizing and appreciating the value of technological progress is part of what will help people recognize the fundamental value of reason and its application to human life, and that's part of how we can get reason applied more broadly throughout the world as well.
Thanks. So I understand that on an individual level, but as a society, what policy should be implemented or what should be done?
There's too much. I mean, if I look out at the country right now, I think the biggest problem, certainly in the US at least, is this tribalistic way of thinking about politics where people just care more about what does my side say and how do I score points rather than thinking deeply about what is true. And then the procedural or the institutional analog to that is things like just the fact that it even became a question whether we were going to have a peaceful transfer of power after an election is just really absolutely damning about our society, right? That's the fundamental, I think, where things need to start. But there's way too much to do to reform society. And I haven't written the book on moral progress yet. I'm working on the technological one first, so yeah.
Okay, thanks. Let me know when it comes out. Thank you.
Yeah. Subscribe, rootsofprogress.org, and you can subscribe and get all my announcements.
Thanks, Jason.
Yes,
Huge fan here. You talked about embracing safety as the part of progress, right? But precautionary principle as it's applied today stunts progress. And I think you'd agree with me there. How do we reposition that? And also more academic research, more technological innovation, all of that is great. But what about putting up an opposition to activism that is already subjecting millions and millions of kids to death and possibly bunch of other things because they don't have access to yellow rice, technology like yellow rice, which came out quite a while back, right? And GMO foods, there's just so much opposition in the developing world and even in developed world.
Yeah.
People like Vanna Shiva, organizations like Greenpeace.
So to answer the second part of that first, I think the absolute fundamental is the history, and that's why I focus so much on the history. We need to tell the story of progress. I think it has probably never been adequately told, not for a general audience, and it's definitely not out there, it's not accessible, people don't learn it. It needs to be common knowledge how much better life has gotten over the last couple hundred years, how terrible living conditions used to be, how much we actually have succeeded, and how much potential there is for the future. I think it's that context that lets people say that GMO rice is actually a good thing. And then, sorry, briefly, what was the first part?
Precautionary principle.
Oh, yeah, okay. Precautionary principle, I have a hard time knowing what that term means. I think people use it in different ways. There's a very weak version of it, which is just like, maybe we shouldn't wait to have absolute certainty before we take some precautionary actions. And there's another really strong form of it, which is like, we should never do anything at all if there might be some unknown risks. The first one is like very common sense. The second one is just a recipe for paralysis. So we can't do that. I think the way to approach safety and risk is by getting as clear as possible on specific risks, right? So not by saying, and sometimes those can be stated at an abstract or general level, and being constructive about it. So it's not just, hey, here's a thing and we're worried and we're gonna like slow down or stop or ban a whole field of research, but here's a thing, we're worried, what are we going to do? To give a very brief example of how this works, in the 1970s, genetic engineers got very worried about what might happen with genetic engineering and whether they might create viruses that could spread and give people cancer or other problems. And they put a temporary ban on, a voluntary ban on certain types of experiments, lasted about 8 months. At the end of that period, they were able to get together in a conference called the Asilomar Conference, where they hashed out a new set of safety procedures for different types of experiments. And then research was able to go forward on the basis using those safety procedures. So that is the kind of like constructive thing where, yeah, maybe you want to slam on the brakes a little bit if you're going too fast, so you don't have the steering mechanism to be safe. But not as we're giving up on progress. It's just we're going to slow down for just as much as we need to figure out how to do this safely.
Thanks.
Hello, I'm from Germany, and this is a country where there's literally zero innovation, like disruptive innovation, in my opinion, in the last 40 years. How do you pitch the concept of progress to a society which is very, very scared of progress and also does not understand why we should have it in the first place, because we're already rich?
Yeah. The first, I think again, it goes back to the history. I feel like once you have heard the stories of how smallpox was eradicated, or how it used to be just hours and hours of backbreaking labor in the field to scrape together the smallest amount of food, or or how people used to live in darkness in the evening because they could barely afford candles, and now we've solved all of these problems. Once you realize how many problems we've actually solved, once you have that full context and you've heard, and these are really compelling stories. They're fascinating stories in their own right, but when you add them all up, it is a view of our place in the universe that I think you can't not have.
What if looking back in history doesn't cut it for those guys?
Well, it's not going to cut it for everybody, right? Some people maybe have absorbed too much of the opposite philosophy and they're just too far gone. But we don't have to convince everybody.
Right.
So
Good.
Do what you can.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm from India, and indeed, this was a very refreshing perspective, especially for the developing world. So my question is, again, on the question of safety as a part of progress. And if I give an example, in India, our government, we had a socialist government for like 7 decades. They hated feudal land-owning landlords, right? And so they decided to become one, which means that 22% of Indian territory today is owned by the Indian Forest Department. Now that goes against the human agency, the progress of envisioned by a person who happens to find their land or habitation in the forest, right? So do you think that we can envision an idea of justice along with the idea of safety, that regulations that are aimed to sort of curtail or manage the forest or whatever shouldn't be violative of the rights of people who live in these areas, livelihoods and a lot of things.
People who live in the forests?
Right, yeah. Around 200 million forest dwellers in India.
Yeah. I don't know how to deal with situations where you have something like this, where there's a resource that you want to, that is a latent resource that could be doing a lot of good, and at the same time, maybe there are people who depend on that, but are living in a much lower state of technology and productivity. I'm going to have to write the book on moral progress before I can tell you how to deal with that one. It's tough because you do want to respect people's rights, and they were there first, and yet at the same time, you don't want to totally hold up progress. I don't know. That's one of the hardest problems.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
I'll write you an email, though, about
Sure,
it.
yeah, we can
sure,
chat about
definitely.
it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. My question is, what are the best ways to measure progress? You talk about some statistics, and you tell the story as well. Life expectancy seems like a pretty good measure. And then there's GDP, which I think you can poke some holes in with, like, where is the money being spent? Like, if people are increasingly spending money on candy, maybe that's like progressively improving people's, you know what I mean?
Yeah, progress is hard to measure. I think there is no one quantitative metric that is going to completely capture human well-being, right? If we say that's the standard by which we would judge whether things are good, there's no human well-being metric. There are lots of things you can do. You can look at GDP. GDP has all sorts of problems. It's a problematic metric. You can just poll people about their life satisfaction and happiness levels. That has a different set of problems. You can look at, I like to just take a look at many different metrics and try to see if they're all telling me the same story, including, just how much are we producing and consuming of key resources? Per capita energy consumption is a great one, very tightly correlated with GDP, by the way. Total passenger miles traveled, right, is an indication of the transportation capability we've built up. Mortality and life expectancy, right? So there's I think there's a small handful of key metrics you could look at that essentially would tell the quantitative story, but there's no one metric of progress.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the talk. As a mechanical engineer, I greatly support that. My question is about the safety progress. Especially, I felt like in the last 100 or 70 years, we dramatically increased the level of safety we required. And that's why we got to the moon with the Saturn V. But approximation said that it has about a 50-50 chance of success. And now SLS is in production for 10 years and still not flying. Are you scared that safety has at some point a priority over progress? You said that morality has to keep up, but I feel like with safety it overtakes progress and it has the #1 priority and it kind of slows down our progress. Do you see that as a problem eventually?
I do think we need a better relationship to safety because we have very restrictive rules that are in the name of safety that are not adding much safety at all. And then we have other areas where you'd think, I'll just give some examples, right? So, just take medicine and disease, right? So on the one hand, a pharmaceutical company is not allowed to market a drug to the public even after it has essentially been proved safe in the US, right? Because they have to go through more phases of clinical trials to prove it effective. So there isn't even a right to try drugs that have been shown to be safe. On the other hand, what have we done to improve pandemic preparedness since COVID? Nothing as far as I can tell, right? So, and we certainly haven't done anything about biosafety or improved safety procedures in labs or anything, again, as far as I have heard of. So it seems like there are big risks that we're just ignoring, and then there's other things where we're way too restrictive and it's just safety theater, right? Or it's some other pathology. So I think we need a better concept of safety and how we approach it. I think we need a better relationship with safety. And I think we need to figure out how to have safety and progress. Again, the two go together, or should go together.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm sorry. I'm Lucas Voltolini from Brazil. I was wondering if you have any research on inequality. When it goes to the subject of development. Since I became a libertarian, I first learned an argument that say, well, inequality is not important if everyone is richer at the end. Therefore, but that's actually not true. Inequality is something that moves people forward. People see, well, he has a nicer car than mine. I could think either, well, I should work more so that I could get a nicer car, or I could steal from him and get it for me. This is actually the kind of argument you see in Brazil all the time right now. So do you have any research on inequality when you go to defend the idea of progress?
Yeah. We have 10 minutes and a lot of people, so I'm going to try to answer briefly. I think people should care more about their absolute well-being than their relative well-being. And so from that standpoint, how is inequality a problem? I think it's a problem if you believe that the inequality is actually due to some fundamental unfairness of the system, right? So certainly in the days in medieval Europe, the days of monarchy and aristocracy, there was a lot of inequality and it was tremendously unfair, right? It was, why should the royal family get to literally lord it over everybody and accumulate riches and all of that, right? So I think the most important thing we have to do is to make sure that the system is fair. And then I think within that, it's much better for everybody to be in an unequal world that is making progress than in a world where somebody is is equal somehow or closer to equal, because we can never be perfectly equal, and where we're not making progress. And you can actually, if you actually just sort of run the numbers of like where would we be, I think this is quite clear. And if you just look today at people who are considered to be living in poverty today, certainly in a wealthy country like the United States, but are below the U.S. poverty line, right? They still have a ton of comforts and advantages that even, the kings, Louis XIV did not have. Louis XIV got smallpox. Nobody gets smallpox anymore. That's just one concrete example, right? So that kind of thing. Thank you.
How's it? I'm a computer scientist and doing my PhD. My areas of focus are optimization problems and machine learning, so thank you. My actual question is, you've spoken a lot about what I term sort of external progress. I was wondering if you had any views on what I'd call internal progress in the sense of, I know there's a lot of contention around how far do we go in things like modifying ourselves in terms of genetic engineering, cybernetics, that sort of things, because personally I would love cybernetic eyes and nanobots to seal up my bullet wounds, but some people say we shouldn't go beyond this point because we're just not human anymore if we go beyond that point. So what are your views on that?
Yeah, that also seems like a real lack of imagination, right? You can't imagine any way we can make our own bodies better. We already improve our bodies, maybe, through things like this, right?
I got LASIK.
There was a quote I read, I forget what era it was from or what time, but somebody said that putting on a pair of eyeglasses is like cheating old age, right? Ha, take that. And we can go further, right? We can get LASIK, so that's, self-modification. Just eating a nutritious diet is sort of, is a modification. But we could go way, way further, and I hope to live long enough to see that happen. I hope to live long enough to see us cure aging and then live even longer. I think absolutely, and it seems like we're on the verge of that in the coming decades, perhaps, right? Biotech and genetic engineering are just at this really interesting inflection point where we might see a real acceleration of progress there, I hope.
Thank you.
Hello. I'd love to know any specific thoughts you might have about David Deutsch and what you think is the best insight in The Beginning of Infinity, and if there's anything in that book that you would dispute.
It's a wide-ranging book. So I'm a David Deutsch fan. A couple of key things I learned from The Beginning of Infinity. I like his, he makes this point about progress that essentially progress is never done. Progress always creates new problems. And we solve those problems with more progress. The fact that progress creates problems is often used as an indictment of progress. And what Deutsch points out very clearly is that this implication is completely wrong. The fact that problems are created is not an indictment of progress. It's just how progress works. It's like whenever we come up with a new scientific theory, it opens new questions for us to answer. You wouldn't say to the scientists, well, you said you were going to bring knowledge, but look, you just created all these new questions. New knowledge opens new questions, and new progress opens new problems as we expand the frontier of what we can do. All right, we're down to less than 5 minutes, so that was maybe the most important point.
Thank you for your talk. What are your thoughts on the risks of artificial intelligence, and could they be mitigated by a moratorium like you mentioned with genetic engineering?
I am still learning about AI and what people think about the risks. For now, I'll just say that I take it seriously. And I am very interested in what we can do. And I've been talking to people in the field and people who are interested in this about what we can do. I don't think anyone, there are very few people who are calling for a complete moratorium, like let's just never develop AI. I think that would be a mistake. And I think most of the people who are serious about this know that AI could be such an amazing boon for the human race if we get it right, that we shouldn't stop it. But maybe we should be developing it very slowly and carefully, like build an AI of a certain power and test it for a while and understand its parameters, and then ramp up the power a little bit, right? I mean, maybe AI needs a version of the Asilomar conference. In fact, I think they've already had one. It's something I need to learn more about. But yeah, getting together and figuring out how do we do this in the safest way, but understanding that we will eventually make progress is how to do it. Slow and steady maybe is the way to do it, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. So I really appreciated your historical understanding of progress, and you showed, throughout history, like you gave the pyramid example, right? That you showed Giza, and I'm sure to the Egyptians, building a pyramid for 25 years of like conscripted labor for the glory of the king. Back then, they thought that was progress, right? So for most of our history, progress has had this collectivist understanding. Post-industrial revolution, which sounds like the kind of progress you like, is progress for a society that's a sum of individuals with more opportunities and well-being than before, if I'm understanding correctly. But with such a collectivist mindset, how do we keep this concept of progress from reverting towards a more collectivist or statist one that serves the power of the state or pharaoh or whatever it is?
Yeah. I can think of, two ideas come to mind. So one is at the level of morality. There's this question of what do we mean by human well-being? I think everybody in the progress movement pretty much would think of human well-being as kind of the core, this is what progress is creating. But how do we think about that? What is human well-being? And so I think there is something powerful and important about human well-being being a thing that is individualistic and that cannot be any other way, right? That your values are your personal values chosen by you. The other thing I would think is that, I do think if you look at the history of progress, there is a huge role of individualism in it, both in helping to create technological progress, and also in just helping to create individual human happiness. And so I hope that a further study of progress will validate that. We can fit in one quick last question and answer. I got like 1 minute.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. I'm surprised at all of the questions regarding risk. And I come from an immunology laboratory science. I come from an immunology and laboratory science background. Risk is something that we dealt with a long time ago under much less technology. I think that then there's a science of risk. You can evaluate risk. Of course, there's risks in everything we do. But what I'm hearing from some of the questions is that risk is something that we need to is something that needs to stall progress. And I think that every time you're developing a product, every time you're inventing something, risk is always going to be there. And you can evaluate it, you can minimize it, you can mitigate it, but it's simply a fact of life. And I think that it is being overblown, to be honest. Your thoughts?
So risk is definitely a fact of life. Risk has always been with us. And again, in many ways, we have never been safer, at least at a day-to-day level. We have very good techniques for dealing with known, understood risks. Something where we can calculate the probabilities or where the form of the risk is known. New drugs, for instance. We know what to do with a new drug. We test it, and we have certain defined ways of testing, and they create a lot of safety around the drugs. Airplanes are extremely safe, right? We've combated the risk. What's really difficult to deal with are the risks of unknown unknowns. We create some brand new technology that we've never had a chance to study. What is that going to create? We don't know, and we can't know. And I think that's where there's a real challenge in figuring out how do we have both progress and safety.
Just don't let the government do it.
Well, okay.
I don't see an email address up there, and I'm wondering if you could tell people how to get in contact with you.
Sure. So at rootsofprogress.org, you can find contact information, and you can email me. I'm jason@rootsofprogress.org. Thank you all.